The Germans launched Operation Baseplate and Operation Northwind on the 31st of December that would last until the 30th of January in 1945, and Operation Dentist was to follow right after Northwind, a plan for the Germans to annihilate Patton's Third Army in a pincer movement around Strasbourg, and Dentist had been personally designed by Hitler. Baseplate began on the 1st of January as the Luftwaffe bombed 16 Allied airfields using hundreds of planes that destroyed 500 Allied aircraft, while the Germans lost 300 planes, but many of those German aircraft had been shot down by Germans who'd not been informed about Baseplate. This would be the Luftwaffe's last hurrah, although the attack on the Maldegem airfield would have done much less damage had Monty not ordered the anti-aircraft defenses moved in December. Northwind set off at the same time as Baseplate and was similarly the German Army's last offensive, hitting the American 7th Army around Strasbourg and causing 25,000 casualties to the Americans before petering out on the 25th of January, and another 25,000 American soldiers were hospitalized because of the cold weather. As Baseplate got underway, Ike had ordered Monty to move south to meet Patton, who was coming up north, and they were supposed to meet to cut off the Germans remaining in the Bulge, forcing them to surrender, but Monty refused to start moving until the 3rd of January, allowing the majority of the Germans to escape back into the fatherland. While Churchill was giving his speech in the House of Commons saying that the Bulge had been an American victory, the British codebreakers at Bletchley swore they had heard nary a whisper about any preparations for the Bulge, and while Northwind was failing at the end of January, the Russians overran Auschwitz. Hitler ordered Himmler on the 25th of January to take his special train to Schneidemühl in northern Poland, to wait at the major railroad junction between Bromberg and Stettin and Posen, all three having double-track rail lines, and there Himmler was to wait for delivery of the treasure gathered from all the Jew looting that had been stored at various camps and subcamps, now being shut down as the Red Army wave washed up into Poland towards Berlin. Himmler's train was to take all the gold to a secret location for safekeeping until the British could convince the Americans that they needed to get into a shooting war with Russia to save the Germans from the unholy Jewish Bolshevism. And this scenario solved the mystery of why the railway lines to the camps weren't bombed, lest all that treasure be irretrievably lost if the Americans won the war. The Germans had been moving the camp prisoners from in front of the advancing Red Army because as soon as a deal was cut with Britain, the concentration camp workers would be needed in pursuit of the war against Russia and as cover for Himmler's mission waiting in his train at Schneidemühl. Hitler gave him the new army of the Vistula that was cobbled together from several battered units, and they were defending the train while it waited for the gold booty to arrive. But Guderian got wind of it and started asking questions when Himmler's train had sat immobile on a siding for 2 weeks without doing anything. Guderian had been born in Prussia and had fought in the Great War, and Guderian had been in the Battle of Moscow when Barbarossa failed due to the Rasputitsa, and Guderian had been fired on Christmas Day in 1941 when the Prussian Eastern Railway had been unable to deliver winter supplies to Guderian's men freezing to death outside Moscow. Seeing Himmler's train sitting on those same tracks that had failed to bring relief to the German army during Barbarossa, Guderian knocked on the door of Himmler's train on the 9th of February to make inquiries. The German word Sonder meant special, and Zug meant train. Zug meant train, and Himmler's train was called the Sonderzug Steiermark or the Sonderzug Heinrich and Steiermark was the name of the Austrian homeland where Himmler had been born, but it had been renamed the Transport 44 when he started using it to pick up special prisoners for a deal in 1944 he was making with Sweden to ransom selected prisoners from the concentration camps and transport them aboard Himmler's special train to the port of Hamburg. On the 5th of December in 1944, the Germans had sent the submarine U-864 to Japan with Messerschmitt jet engines on board so the Japanese could begin producing Japanese fighter planes powered by Messerschmitt jet engines, and the Germans had included all the blueprints and instructions for building V-2 rockets, and on the 6th of February a British submarine torpedoed U-864, and the Norwegians would later cover the wreck with hundreds of thousands of tons of rocks and sand to seal the U-boat's contents inside. The first British air raid by the RAF had been on Hanover the day after Britain declared war on Germany, and that had been a single RAF plane dropping leaflets on the capital city of Hanover with 2 N's. And the final British Operation Eclipse meant to put the British in charge of Hanover and northeast Germany, while the Americans were kept down south in reserve so they could be turned like trained dogs against Russia under British command. And a map and plans of Eclipse were sent to Germany from Monty's headquarters, but had been captured by the Americans during the Bulge. Monty claimed those plans for Eclipse were a forgery, but a duplicate had already been delivered to the Americans by the Germans before the Bulge, seeking arrangements for all the young German soldiers being held as POWs, and so FDR had drawn up a map of his own, putting the Americans where the British wanted to be, and sending Monty down to Strasbourg so the French could yell at him a little. And the French in Strasbourg preferred Germany to the British choice of de Gaulle. When the British had headed for the Channel ports in 1940, as soon as the French marched into Flanders, they'd been left alone to face the Germans, and by November of 1944, the French built 60-kilowatt mobile transmitters bolted inside vans for Ike's use that let the Americans speak directly to Washington without having to wait for a channel through London. That precious radio contact that had become unavailable during D-Day and during Market Garden. Hitler went on the radio on the 30th of January in 1945 and told everyone to hang on. And the thinking in the German General Staff revolved around the idea that Napoleon's last great victory on German soil had been at Dresden, and that Napoleon had easily taken Hanover away from the British. The Russians were 50 miles away from Berlin when, according to an RAF memo issued to airmen the night before attacking the city of Dresden, they were not to hit the surrounding industrial and manufacturing areas, and the primary purpose of the raid was to, quote, show the Russians when they arrive what Bomber Command can do, close quote. At the British briefing for the bombing of Dresden, the Polish airmen in the RAF were told about the Yalta Agreement and were informed that FDR had given Poland to the Russians 3 days earlier at the Crimea Conference, and Dresden was firebombed on the 13th and 15th of February, 3 days after Monty was given his American troops to prevent it. After taking Hanover away from Germany, Napoleon had won his last big battle at Dresden in 1813 and was finally beaten at Leipzig, just 60 miles west of Dresden, and that had been his last stand in Germany. And while Patton was making plans to march on Leipzig, bombs were dropped on Dresden for 14 hours, and it would take 10 years to clear away the rubble. The British ordered the firebombing of Dresden 1 year to the day after FDR had spoken to America over the radio about his demand for unconditional surrender, setting forth the American policy that no separate peace deals would be tolerated. Hitler's favorite, Frederick II the Great, had beaten Maria Theresa's army 5 miles outside Dresden in 1745, and then had become the hero of the 7 Years' War with his victory in 1757 on the battlefield 20 miles outside Dresden. And the 7 Years' War was won because the British had switched sides to join with the Prussians and told them where all the enemy camps and supplies were. Dresden was on the Elbe River, 40 miles south of Torgau, and as the Americans were marching into Germany, Hitler was broadcasting Wagner's Frederick the Great over the radio. There were only 2 bridges left to cross the Rhine in February of 1945. The bridge at Remagen and the Wesel Railroad Bridge, and Wesel was 50 miles downstream from Cologne and 40 miles upstream from Arnhem, and the British destroyed Wesel completely from the air on the 16th and 19th of February, and what was left of the city would be shelled again on the 23rd of March before Monty's army crossed the Rhine under cover of artificial fog. Ike had decided on the 15th of March to no longer support the British plans for a single thrust, and the British newspapers had been reporting on Monty's glorious march to the Rhine. But on the 7th of March, Patton had captured the bridge across the Rhine at Remagen and had taken 25,000 American soldiers across by the time Monty got across, and the bridge at Remagen stayed up long enough to give Patton enough time to use it for 10 days, and he also built another 2 bridges downstream, and 6 of Patton's divisions were across the Rhine when Hitler promulgated his Scorched Earth Command on the 19th of March. To cross the Rhine up north, Monty had ordered the largest and the last parachute drop of the war, setting 20,000 soldiers down near Wesel, and it had been done in full daylight so the British press could take good photos, and the daylight drop allowed the Germans to shoot up half the gliders on their slow descent and hit the rest in something of a skeet shoot for the well-trained Germans, who inflicted 2,000 casualties, after which 3,500 of them would surrender. A further 30,000 Germans would surrender in the following week, and the newspapers got their story and their statistics, although an American parachute division had accidentally landed on top of the British division in their zone and had thus escaped enemy fire upon landing, and that was not luck, but the result of having just flown through intense German anti-aircraft fire that had missed the British planes but hit 60 American planes. On the day Monty crossed the Rhine, the British won back Burma for Britain, linking it to India again, and that was the best effort and the most remarkable feat for the British in the entire war. India was a vast supply depot from which America's Lend-Lease program had been buying trucks and ammunition and food, sending it from India to Russia, and the British had built over 40,000 miles of railroads in India by the 1930s. And Britain promised the Indians Dominion status, but not independence, for their cooperation in the war effort. At the end of June, after D-Day in 1944, the bulk of the Canadian Army and the Poles and the Indian troops had arrived in the British sector in Normandy, and they were called Dominion troops, and the Indians in India had been training since 1938 3 divisions organized as armored, even though they had no tanks, in India with which to practice. Dominion troops came from Australia and Africa and Canada and India and New Zealand, as well as various smaller colonies, and India had endless numbers of people who could be turned into soldiers, although India had been agitating for independence since 1935. The British trained 130,000 Indian troops in 1939 and added another 200,000 by the summer of 1940, and by 1945 there were 2.5 million soldiers carrying arms for Britain, an easy recruitment program using the Lend-Lease money with its lure of great wages, and there had been 4,500 British officers in India in 1939, with 500 of them natives of India. The general understanding in Britain was that Americans were simply colonial British, and Monty looked at the Americans the same as other Dominion troops, and he treated America as just another rebellious colony. British colonial masters expected to be treated with the utmost deference by the locals, and were horrified at the familiarity practiced by Americans, who called it equality while the British called it communism. FDR hated colonialism and the misery it brought to native populations and to the foreigners shipped in to work for them as slaves, and when Americans used the word freedom, the British thought it meant empire, and when Americans used the words private enterprise, the British thought it meant privateering or piracy, with the freedom to take freely from others, or downright clear-cut thievery. Britain and America were two brothers born of a common language, sharing the same mother, while the younger would rule the elder. And the French had taken a different tack by attempting to turn their colonials into French citizens, and that usually didn't work out very well for France. Washington had crossed the Delaware to turn his back on his former British masters, and Washington escaped across the river, not just militarily, but also socially, because the British had looked down on Washington for consorting with commoners and black folk and drunken Hessians. And in the boat with Washington as he crossed the Delaware was his friend and aide of African origin. Washington had been more of a commoner, while the British believed in being well-dressed and snobby, and while Patton was a stickler for uniform protocol, he was also a common American, and as soon as Patton was successful in Sicily, the British newspapers started smearing him for slapping a soldier, because the British had strict rules about not abusing servants, and to British officers, the English soldier was a servant who should never be slapped.